it can make anything, and it's why there are all those cliffhangers in reality television, like, commercial, right? And you wait and you wait and you wait for the reveal, but you know the real reveal is coming and you know what it's going to be, right? All of that is the manipulation of point of view and restricted and unrestricted narration through editing. So I would say that there's a form, I'm so obsessed with this, right? There's a formal structure to the excess that you enter into and you consent to, and that's what creates that structure of response and feeling. So it's both why it's weird, and it's also why it works, right? That's what it can do in the absence of having, good writing, good acting, like anything else that we care about. It has none of that. It just has that dynamic of the play of perspective, and then, the whatever experience we have of our fellow human beings, talent or lack thereof, right? Yeah, so it's interesting. But pay attention to that editing sometime, because you'll learn something about that structure.
One more question. When affected by the melodrama, we have feeling of the intersubjectivity, but this kind of feeling for me is not necessarily political, and sometimes it can also be apolitical, because I know your suffering, but I feel that I can do nothing to help you, or I just keep silent. So how can we transform the feeling of intersubjectivity into political actions?
That is, again, along with your questions, it is the question of the age. It is the question that people have been asking for centuries. How does sympathy or empathy translate into action? What's the relation between feeling in the place of and acting on behalf of, right? And there are millions of accounts of that, right? One is that you just bypass rational action altogether. That was Hitler's idea. You just rouse the body into action through the spectacle of belonging, and you bypass the need to make any decisions. The same might be said of Soviet Russian cinema, that you trigger revolutionary impulses through dialectical montage, and you bypass rational decision-making or rational deliberation, and you just feel revolutionary. Dziga Vertov thought it, right? Maybe that works. I don't know.
Because the narrative of melodrama is very different from Soviet films or propaganda film.
Mm-hmm. So maybe, the same theory might have been in the 1930s and 40s when melodramas were very directly addressed to a female audience living under the constraints of heteropatriarchy. One argument might be that melodrama led to the women's movement. Women were awakened to recognize the suffering that patriarchy imposed upon them, right? And wept into action, right? In the post-war period. right? Or that the new woman in the 1920s and the 1930s in Shanghai cinema, right, was created through structures of feeling and recognition that transcended the constraints of femininity that had obtained in China until the 1930s. You know, there are all sorts of ways of thinking about how melodrama might have the capacity to produce recognition of constraint, right? One of the reasons we might be crying is that we know that life sucks, or that rules are bad, or that marriage is awful, or that being a parent is hard, right? Or any of those things that melodrama helps us understand, and that might lead to different conceptions of the world. But nothing's guaranteed to be political in that regard, right? And it depends on how the ground for action and deliberation is prepared. And cinema, I'm afraid, can't do all that work. Some of it has to come from other quarters, like education, or the domain of the political, properly speaking, right? Electoral processes, simple forms of communication with political intent, right? Those can also be massified bodies, right? In the streets, bodies in streets can produce political action, but maybe not always through melodrama.
One last question. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, my question is, in earlier time we went to the theater for films.
Yeah.
Melodramas, horrors, even horror.
Yeah.
But nowadays it was more like a rite,
Yeah.
religious rite.
Yeah.
And we went to the theater.
Yeah.
And before we went to the theater, and we are prepared to be affected.
Yeah.
But nowadays, we watch all kind of material on just streaming media.
Yeah.
It's a time of television.
Yeah.
We watch them everywhere, and I watch films on my laptop.
Yes.
Even on my iPhone, and
Yeah.
people do that.
Yeah.
But still, people are affected by melodramas or soap operas.
Yes.
Yeah, that's you play it anytime you want, and you're affected anytime you want.
Yeah.
So my question is, before there is a certain space that is created by the location
Yeah.
and the equipment. We're sitting in the darkness.
Yes.
And be prepared. It's like more. It's almost religious.
Yeah.
But nowadays, when we are affected by any stuff that we see we watch on the screen,
Yeah.
on the portable devices.
Yeah.
So, is there? Let's assume that there is a space that has been created for us to put ourselves in it and to be affected.
Yeah.
So, is the space the same?
Right.
And after the transformation of the media.
Yeah. That's a wonderful question also. It takes us right to the heart of the question of historicity, of the question of history and how history changes not only our media and our relationship to our media, but the status of those transformations more broadly in terms of our lives. And so I think you're right to say that there was a quasi-religious dimension to theatrical performance and a ritualistic dimension to much of it. There's also the need, because we live in a world of hierarchies, to see theater as a pure experience with transformative possibilities, and the media as a degraded and somehow diluted, if not altogether feminized, and insufficient form of culture, right? So there have always been hierarchies of culture, and in particular, theater has been exalted as a form in part because of the uncertainty of live performance and the bond that we as audience members experience with vulnerable performers for whom anything could go wrong. You could forget a line and be standing in your human vulnerability in front of live, breathing other human beings. You could change a line, or trip on stage, or throw a prop in the wrong direction, and the whole night would be transformed. It would be different every time. And that sense of the magic of being together, creating something that will never be repeated, is part of the ritualistic dimension of theater. Right? And so the question is, does our media experience replicate that? Probably not. I would say it's a very different experience, even a different experience of this than sitting in a dark theater where the projected image is larger than life and that takes us in a way that's different from watching at night on an iPhone. So I think we have to respect the differences and then think about the claims that we want to make about where ritual happens in 21st century experience. We still have lots of experiences of shared embodiment. One of them is in this room, I would say, right? Where we're all breathing human beings, right? Looking at each other, taking it in. This will never happen again. It's just today, right? And it may not have the same sort of inflection of theatrical performance, but it still is a massing of bodies in an experience of shared humanity and change. So I think that the answer is, I think that there are real significant differences. And then we have to think about what those differences mean for us as people. Maybe that's what I'll start.
If you are too shy and you still have questions to ask Professor Villarrejo, you are always welcome to talk to her. Okay. So let's thank Professor Villarrejo for a truly wonderful, engaging, and intellectually stimulating seminar.
Great.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful questions. Thank you.